So I wanted to just shoot a quick video introducing the Dan Brock article on voluntary active euthanasia. I don't want to go over the entire article, but the topic in question, and sort of the main thing I wanted to discuss for this week, which we're doing the other readings as supportive for, is physician-assisted suicide, right? So in the United States, we have long thought that it's perfectly okay for somebody to deny treatment, to say, I don't want this life-saving treatment, don't force it upon me, and then that people have the ability to turn down treatments. And so we can passively let people die if they ask for it. We can even remove life-saving equipment or, life support systems if somebody asks us to take them off of that to let them die. But in the United States, at least 2 decades ago, in every state, it was a felony for a doctor to not merely remove the life support system, but to actively help somebody die, to give them a prescription of drugs that they could overdose on and die, or to inject them with something to put them out of their misery, at the end of life when they're in extreme suffering, that it was a felony to help them do that. Now, in the 13 years ago when I first taught this class, it was just recently made legal in Oregon, and now I think it's legal in 20-ish states, including the District of Columbia, to have a doctor help a patient die if they are. Usually the requirements are you're within, your diagnosis means you're going to die in the next 2 years. You're in extreme suffering, and you have to ask the doctor in writing, and then wait 6 months and ask again in writing, and then get a second doctor's opinion, and then be visited by a psych. There's a long procedure before presumably the doctor's allowed to actively kill you or provide you with drugs so you could kill yourself actively. So that's the topic, right? Should it be? Is it moral for doctors or anybody to help somebody else die? And I guess there's the broader question of suicide. We should think about, well, what about younger cases of some 16-year-old kid who wants to commit suicide over their girlfriend who broke up with them, things like that. But the sort of case that is currently under debate is when you've got somebody who is in extreme suffering, who cannot be saved, and who is going to die in the next year or two, and somebody who wants to skip those last years of extreme suffering and extreme financial hardship on them and their family, and die in what people like to call a dignified way, to take some drugs or be injected with something while they still have their wits about them, while they're still in control of their faculties and can be with their family as they pass, instead of descending slowly into a maybe painful, prolonged death. So that's what we're talking about mainly this week, and the Brock piece is meant to try and to formulate and evaluate the main arguments for and against voluntary active euthanasia. So voluntary in that the patient's awake and asking for it, and active euthanasia in that the doctor is either injecting them or providing them pills so that they, loading the gun and handing it to them type thing, or, pulling the trigger themselves. That's different from involuntary active euthanasia, which is just murder. That's when someone's saying, please don't kill me, and you do kill them. But importantly, it's different from non-voluntary active euthanasia. So non-voluntary would be somebody who's unconscious, and so you don't know their wishes, but you know that maybe they're in a permanent vegetative coma or something like that. That's another question, right? If not, do we extend our acceptance? If we accept voluntary active euthanasia, do we then extend that to some cases of non-voluntary active euthanasia for patients who are, are brain dead, but still, have enough capacity to keep breathing, and we can, keep feeding them in feeding tubes for 20 years until they die of natural causes? Or can those people be euthanized even though you don't know their wishes? That's one extended case. The other cases, do we need to respect 15-year-olds who are trying to commit suicide because of their girlfriend broke up with them? But let's start with the less controversial case, and then we'll see if we're forced into those other ones, which is just somebody who is dying and in a lot of pain and asking voluntarily for a doctor to help them or to kill them, help them kill themselves or to kill them, not just remove treatment, but to give them something that will actively kill them. So one of the arguments that Brock gives for voluntary active euthanasia is, he says, we believe it's legitimate for patients to make decisions about whether to initiate or continue life-saving, sustaining treatment. The basis of our judgment is that the basis of our judgment that this is legitimate is an appeal to the goodness of self-determination, autonomy, being able to decide for yourself, what's good for you, and well-being, that we want to help people escape suffering. But voluntary active euthanasia would also promote these values, respecting patients' choices. Remember, they're asking us to help them kill themselves, and it would promote well-being because they're in a lot of suffering. So we have significant reason to be in favor of voluntary active euthanasia. That's the basic argument. This appeal to respecting free choices and the sort of utilitarian value of promoting happiness and alleviating suffering. A couple objections. One is, even when voluntary active euthanasia would promote a patient's autonomy and well-being, it is wrong, for it involves the deliberate killing of an innocent person, and such killing is always wrong. One response, though, here you might say, one response he offers is that the withdrawal of treatment, when we just remove when we pull somebody off of life support because they ask us to, that's also the deliberate killing of an innocent person. So either we're mistaken in concluding that that's okay, or it's okay to actively kill somebody when they ask you to, in the same circumstances. In order for that reply to work, he needs to deny the distinction between active and passive killing. You might say, well, there's this real big difference between the doctor actively killing somebody versus passively removing treatment and letting somebody die. So we think a lot about whether you think that distinction makes any sense. If it's true that there is a moral difference between actively doing something to kill somebody versus passively letting them die. I tend to think that there's not a very good distinction there. In both cases, you're making a decision to either remove the equipment so that they die, or you're giving them something so that they die. So this active-passive distinction doesn't make sense to me, because they both involve an active choice to adopt a course of action or inaction, which leads to someone's death in order that they die. So I don't think that you could allow for us to remove treatment when someone asks for it to let them die, but not also provide treatment to help them kill themselves when they ask, on the basis of this active-passive distinction, because that does not seem like a good philosophical distinction to me. Although it is one that the U.S. Supreme Court endorses legally. I think it's a mistake, but it is one that's embedded in our laws. Some advantages and disadvantages of legally permitting voluntary active euthanasia. Advantages: we would respect the self-determination of those who are competent and want to die but cannot under current law. We would give people the comfort of knowing that if they find themselves in a situation in which they would prefer voluntary active euthanasia, it would be available to them. And we would relieve pain and suffering, both physical and psychological. Disadvantages. So here's a couple things we need to consider, and Brock tries to respond to. We would undermine the fundamental professional and moral commitments of physicians. So the idea here is that doctors are there to save lives, to do no harm, to keep people alive. And the idea is that there's something fundamentally wrong about having doctors not just solely dedicated to saving lives, but allowing them to also help end lives. Brock offers his response to that. I mean, you can see doctors as trying to alleviate suffering and respect the wishes of patients and be dedicated to that, and not necessarily dedicated to saving lives. But maybe there's an argument to be made there that there's something in conflict between the profession of medical care and the providing of methods of suicide or killing somebody who's asking for it and in terrible suffering, pain. We would make certain people worse off by giving them the choice of whether to opt for euthanasia. Once you introduce that possibility, all of a sudden they're thinking about the cost of, like, is it selfish for me to try staying alive? It's going to cost all this money, and that's going to cost my family money. And the idea here is something like, it's just better off if you don't even present that as an option, because once you present that as an option, you're putting a lot on that patient and pressuring them just by offering the option. And so we should not offer the option, because we make certain people worse off by providing them that option. It would be better if we just kept that off the table. I think that probably wouldn't really respect people's autonomy, but anyway, that's one possible response that people have offered. We would fall down a slippery slope to non-voluntary or involuntary active euthanasia. So the idea here is, if we allow active voluntary euthanasia, that doctors helping people who are asking to die because they're at the end of their life and in extreme suffering and begging to be put out, to let them die, or help them kill themselves, we would that is just the start of a slippery slope, and we would then end up euthanizing people who are non-voluntary, people who are unconscious and in comas. There's lots of hospital beds being taken up by vegetables who won't die for 20 years and who are, their brain is rotted. And once we start allowing voluntary active euthanasia, then we've breached the gap to where we're comfortable actively killing people in a medical context, and then we might stop requiring people to ask us to kill them and start thinking, well, this person would be better off dead, so we're just going to euthanize them even though they're in a coma and we can't know. There's also, I think, worries that you might start relaxing people's attitudes towards suicide in general. We might go down a road where you end up taking a general societal attitude which is more embraces and more accepting of committing suicide, which then encourages more suicides, even in contexts where people aren't at the end of their life and in terrible suffering, but in 16-year-olds who get dumped by their boyfriend or girlfriend and think their life is over. The idea here is just in general that once we start allowing people, like accepting as a society that it's okay for people in certain contexts to ask to be killed and us to kill them, that is going down a slippery slope where we're going to become much more comfortable with actively killing people. And there is some reason to fear this in Scandinavian countries, from what I understand, where voluntary active euthanasia has been, physician-assisted suicide has been in place for many years. It's become, suicide rates are much higher. Suicide is a much more accepted practice. It's a much more accepted option when you go to the hospital. Getting the sort of prescription in those countries to be given a drug to kill yourself is kind of like getting a prescription for marijuana in the U.S. Like, there are shady doctors you can go to and get one pretty easily. So there maybe it's particular to those countries. Maybe this is not a worry here, but it does seem like there are some examples of countries where they have gone down the road of legalizing and normalizing physician-assisted suicide, and it has led them to go quite further in the sort of direction of normalizing, accepting, and promoting suicide in ways that we might find troubling. So that might be an argument again. I mean, one thing response to the slippery slope argument is like, well, if voluntary active euthanasia in this case is legitimate and promotes welfare and autonomy and we should allow it, then we should allow it, and we should fight the slippery slope from happening if the slippery slope is a bad thing. But we shouldn't fight the slippery slope by forcing people to live who are in terrible pain and begging us to help them die quicker when they're going to be dead pretty soon anyway. Anyway, there's lots of responses to these objections. This week is mostly about physician-assisted suicide, or that's how I envisioned it. I have the Nagel reading on death, which is just about death in general, and I've got the Velleman piece, which is an argument from a Kantian perspective against suicide and euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. And I have a lecture which I've posted about Kantian approaches to suicide, which is loosely connected to the Velleman article, but I don't directly go over it. I sort of give sort of broad Kantian approach to suicide, which connects up to what the Velleman article says, but I don't really go over the Velleman article. Just like I'm not really going over the Brock article, I'm just sort of offering a big picture introduction to it. So when you read it, you've got some background, I guess. All right, well, enjoy the article. It's not, I don't think you enjoy a thing on suicide, so that's the wrong thing to say, but something, the end.